3 billion years ago, we were floating atoms in a planetary petri dish. Fast forward to 4000 BCE, in the Mesopotamian city of Uruk, where humanity attempted to rewrite its biological destiny through agriculture. This shift came with a physical cost. Before agriculture, relying on hunting and gathering, the average man stood 5'9". After the transition to a diet of cultivated cereal grains like wheat and barley, average male height dropped to 5'3". Instead of roaming free as athletic hunter-gatherers, the citizens of Uruk became landlocked. To ensure a steady food supply, they remained tethered to their fields year-round. We traded mobility for a predictable harvest. The ability to create our own food source transformed independent, nomadic survivors into stationary tools required to feed an expanding population. These monuments manifest a rigid social hierarchy. In ancient Egypt, millions lived and worked solely to serve a single ruler. Peasants farmed to feed the empire, and when the harvest ended, they were drafted into manual labor to construct these massive tombs. Every ounce of their physical effort was extracted and funneled upward to guarantee the pharaoh's spiritual immortality. By 1772 BCE, King Hammurabi codified this inequality into law. The laws inscribed here established a specific worth for different classes. Breaking a noble's bone meant your own was broken, but breaking a slave's bone resulted only in a fine, a payment for property damage. For millennia, these codes defined the limits of a human life. Inequality was the law. A person had no value beyond the labor or utility they provided to the ruling elite. Cracks in this model began to form in ancient Greece. While Eastern empires demanded absolute obedience, Athenian society began experimenting with the idea that ordinary citizens should have a voice in state affairs. They built an assembly governed by a process known as sortition. Using a machine of tubes and balls, Athens randomly selected 500 citizens each year to make major geopolitical decisions. The philosopher Plato saw this as dangerous. He argued that just as you wouldn't trust a randomly selected passenger to navigate a ship, you shouldn't trust an untrained citizen to run a state. He insisted that true governance required the specialized wisdom of a philosopher king. In China, the Zhou dynasty established the mandate of heaven. This doctrine declared that a ruler's power was a conditional right granted by merit. If an emperor failed to protect the people from floods or famines, the universe had the right to revoke his authority. These disparate philosophies introduced a radical premise, the idea that rulers owe a duty of competence and justice to the people they rule. Despite these ideas, the physical reality of the ancient world remained dominated by the sword. Genghis Khan united 1 million people and swept across Eurasia using psychological terror. His cavalry routinely used civilian captives as human shields to breach fortified cities, conquering more territory in 25 years than the Romans did in 400. In Europe, the relentless raids of pagan Vikings destroyed towns and monasteries. The constant threat of violence drove the population back toward a more restrictive social order. Out of this panic, feudalism emerged. Millions of peasants surrendered their freedom, agreeing to farm the land and pay heavy taxes to local nobles in exchange for armed protection. Centuries later, Niccolò Machiavelli summarized the logic of these rulers, writing that it is safer to be feared than loved, because fear is preserved by a dread of punishment that never fails. That dread is what kept the masses anchored at the bottom of the pyramid. Humanity traded its autonomy for the basic promise of surviving the next invasion. The rigid structures of the feudal order were eventually fractured by a force no king could conquer, a biological one. As the bubonic plague traveled along global trade routes, it wiped out dense population centers, killing between 75 and 200 million people. This death toll triggered a macroeconomic crisis. With up to half the workforce dead, land-owning nobles had vast fields of crops, but no one to harvest them. This labor shortage gave the surviving peasants umbrage. Because their physical work was now scarce, farmers could successfully demand better wages and the right to own their own labor. A biological accident had inverted the social hierarchy. The sudden scarcity of labor revealed a reality the elites had spent centuries obscuring. Their wealth was entirely dependent on the value of the people at the bottom. That leverage translated into legal limits on absolute power. In England, the Magna Carta established the right to due process, ensuring that even a king could not imprison a subject without a lawful reason. This rebellion spread to religious authority. By challenging the sale of certificates for the forgiveness of sins, Martin Luther fractured the centralized power of the church. Cultural focus shifted. Renaissance artists began celebrating the perfection and beauty of the human form itself, rather than using art solely to glorify divine kings. By 1776, this evolution reached a legal climax. A group of colonials signed a document stating that all men are created equal, endowed with rights that no government has the power to take away. This transition marks a departure from the ancient model of the pyramid. Civilization shifted from a system where value was granted by a ruler to one where it is recognized as an inherent part of being human.